Thank you. So we're going to have a little discussion for a bit, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And so there are, I think, a couple of standing mics, and so we will talk among ourselves for about 35 minutes or so, and then open it up. And so I'm joined, you've already met Daryl Ford Williams, the executive producer of this incredible documentary. And so, Daryl, again, thank you.
Thank you.
And then to my immediate right is Mara Ostfeld, who is the research director at the Center for Racial Justice and associate research scientist in the Ford School of Public Policy here at the University of Michigan. And among other things that Mara does, she also leads the Detroit metro area community studies, which is a series of surveys, and has been doing a great deal of surveying of late about attitudes about reparations in our immediate area. And so we'll turn to Mara in a few minutes. Next to Mara is Lauren Hood, who is the founder and chief visionary of the Institute for Afro-Urbanism in Detroit, was in the past co-chair of the Detroit Task Force on Reparations, and as of the fall of 2023, she has joined the faculty at the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she is an assistant professor of practice. And then to my far right is Elise Asbury-Payne, who is the racial equity officer here in Washtenaw County. Elise told me this some time ago, a proud native of California and specifically San Francisco, and so, but someone who has been working in the area of community-centered policy and change and equity for more than 2 decades. And so, welcome to you all. And so, Daryl has seen this film in every form over the last period, and for some of you it is brand new. But let me just start with a general question. Each time I watch it, I see something new. And so, Daryl, let me start with you. What did you see this time as you watched the film?
I'll tell you specifically, one thing I heard differently this time is when Sarah Eisner is talking about her family's legacy with slavery, and she says that the first slaves that her ancestors owned came to them by marriage. And she's a lovely person, and she's doing really important work, but just to synthesize it like that for me, you know, I have dishes that came to me through marriage, but when you think about people being considered in that same vein, that jumped out to me today.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll come back to that piece about how we deal with what we remember and how the stories are told. Lauren, what's your reaction?
So many things. What comes to mind first is there was the Republican pundit talking about how something 10 generations ago. I actually know the name of the enslaved member of my family on both sides. So let's see, dad's side. Lawrence Hood is my dad. His father was Howard Hood. His father was Harry Hood. His father was Philander Hood, who was enslaved. On my mom's side, my mom is Ida Hood. Her mom was Ethel Irvin. Her mom was Mary Benson, and her mother was Ann Benson, who was enslaved. So my mom is still alive. My mom met Ann Benson when she was a child. So when people talk about how this is something that was so long ago, it's ever present. It's so close. It's so close. That's what stood out most.
Yeah. You realize you can touch one person who can touch another, and they touch that past.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who is still here.
Yeah, very much. Mara, what's your reaction?
I think as someone who studies public opinion, I was really interested in how proponents and some of the depicted opponents of reparations relied on different narratives about saying, to highlight their positions. So the point that some of the Republican people were making about how it's just a huge cost, one, but there's plenty of forms of reparations that we pay all the time to people who suffered from dealing with natural disasters, to people who've had to endure internment or other disasters, we've actually had a ton of instances of reparations. So it's interesting that this one somehow stands apart in their framing as being difficult. I think the other thing that stood out as the point on the importance of remembrance. And there's just so much evidence about how, again, narratives play a really important role in support. So when we have these efforts to kind of reduce emphasis on Black history in the education that we're giving to our youth, how that kind of feeds into this kind of downplaying of the importance of reparations and pushes people away from understanding reparations and its place in American history.
Yeah. Elisa, what do you think?
I have so many feelings about this film. It makes me angry every time I watch it because it's something that registers as being painful. As a person who works in government and public policy specifically, the argument that these are not contemporary issues is so incredibly flawed. Our entire democracy is built on documents that shaped the country hundreds of years ago. So to say, well, this is 10 generations old, this is too far in our history to be relevant today when we are still dealing with the ever-present consequences when you look at racial wealth gap, when you look at health outcomes, education disparity. These are all things that are contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the filmmaking as we think about what we've just seen. So, Darryl, I'll start with you and ask this question. Reparations is such a large topic, and we got a little sense of that as we talked about the various elements here. How did you begin to narrow the focus to tell a singular story or at least a connected story?
So it is a big topic. I mean, you can think about reparations on a global level. You can think about reparations in this country as it addresses many different populations. But we knew from our work with the various university partners that were a part of this that we were talking about reparations for African Americans, and that as we heard the scholarly presentations, what we thought really resonated with us from a quantifiable perspective were stories about wealth disparities and land displacement. And those are solid metrics. You can look at many other social metrics and maybe attribute them to one thing or another, but it's hard to turn away from that kind of clear data. And so we thought that we would narrow, and we only had an hour. We thought that we would narrow our focus to those driving themes. And in the course of pursuing those themes, we heard stories that brought not just the data to us, but that brought the humanity, that brought the people who were doing this work to life in a way that I think really, really helped with a narrative that was built on something you could feel.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure there's some sitting in the audience wondering, okay, but how did you find the people? I mean, so how do you go about identifying the individuals who end up in a film like this?
Yeah, so first of all, we started this process in COVID, full COVID, right? And so we were on Zoom, and most productions start with what we call school, because we make TV. We're not subject matter experts, so we have to lean into the scholars that are a part of any subject. And so we leaned heavily on the university partners. And I remember having my production team join in on a big Zoom that was an all teams presentation. And I'm looking at all the squares, this thing on Zoom. And as one of the presenters was talking about the Quarterman Keller story, I noticed that all of my team started scribbling notes at the same time because it struck a chord with us that's an interesting thread, that the ancestors of an enslaver and the ancestors of an enslaved are now working together jointly to preserve land. So we liked that. And then we started digging deeper into research, and as you find people, I take it through a couple of litmus tests. One is is there a story? Are the people willing to tell it? And are they good storytellers? Because not everyone can communicate their story well, or can we draw it out of them? So that was part of that's part of the creative process to determine what stories to tell. And then there's so many that we shot that we just couldn't fit in an hour. So you look for the mix of stories that will weave a narrative arc. And that's where we landed on the stories that we did. You clearly could not turn away from Farmer Boyd. I mean, he was a very compelling character and talked about something that really brings that story of past harms right through to today. And I thought his story was just amazing. And we found him through research, just looking for articles and digging for examples of where reparations was happening. And Sarah and Randy we talked about. And then we stumbled across Lottie and Brianna as people who were doing reparations work. But we wanted to see one of their presentations. Well, they weren't doing anything in person. Everything was virtual, which wasn't going to communicate. And when we finally had an opportunity to get them in person, even though we had wrapped up most of our shooting, we opened up the process and went back and shot that really moving scene in the church.
Yeah, thank you. All right, you study attitudes, and I know you've had both a series of surveys in Detroit, but also in and around Flint. So what are you learning? What's now grabbing a hold of residents in Detroit and Flint when the topic of reparations comes?
We've asked attitudes about reparations and different forms of reparations. So I think we found something that many people wouldn't be surprised by, that especially non-Black residents are far less supportive of cash transfers than they are of kind of more paternalistic forms of reparations, where they can control how the goods are distributed in terms of housing repairs or education vouchers. And so we see this kind of paternalism pervade a lot of non-Black residents' attitudes towards reparations. But we've also found that in certain contexts, I think something we're really interested in what are the levers where we can actually start to see people's opinions shift. And something that we found to be really important, not in all contexts, but in certain contexts, is a lot of people just don't understand how Jim Crow and enslavement and mass incarceration contribute to the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap that we see today. And so helping people understand that more and connect it more to present day realities is just a really important factor in how some people understand attitudes towards reparations, especially in contexts that are not majority Black. There's not as much of an emphasis on that. So that's something that we're trying to explore more.
At the national level, what's the gap, racial gap, in terms of support for reparations?
On the national level, it's about 77% of Black people support reparations compared to about 18% of white people. So it's a pretty significant gap. There's a lot of variation within groups. Obviously, younger people are more supportive, more liberal people are more supportive, so there's levers.
And so reparations has become part of public policy, both in Washtenaw County and in Detroit. Lisa, let me start with you. And so tell us a little bit about what's happening in Washtenaw County with respect to reparations.
I was getting ready to say this year and realize we're in 2024. The Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners established an advisory council on reparations to create the Washtenaw County Reparations Plan. And they did two very important things in that action. One, created a framework to have institutional level conversations about what reparations need to look like in Washtenaw County, but also made a statement of acknowledgement of this harm that has happened in the community that government is responsible for addressing and repairing. And I think that is a framework that government as the institution is responsible for institutional impact, is responsible for addressing institutional racism, is important in the acknowledgement of harm. So our council has been seated, and we have had the benefit of participating with the Center for Social Solutions and seeing the work that is happening at the national level in both community and educational institutions, and also our neighbors, our much larger neighbors down the road, and what's happening in Detroit, and pulling those best practices in terms of how do we start the conversation, who needs to be at the table, what does it look like to craft a framework that addresses harm and puts together actionable solutions, because that's one of the things that I think comes up often when we're talking about government. What does this translate to in terms of tangible resource and support for community?
And is there a timeline? This commission, council will be in existence for how long, or?
So we're a perpetual body,
Okay.
And that was intentionally done because the harm that's happened has been generational. And so the idea is that we have time to do this work. Now, you don't want to give people too much time to do work, which is why our council members are sat in 2-year terms. But the idea is that the Washtenaw County government is making generational investment in this.
Great, thank you. So Lauren, and I'm going to ask about 23 and not ask you to project into 24, but tell us a little bit about what Detroit went through in 23 in terms of creating the task force and trying to get it up and operating.
So there was a ballot initiative led by who is now the co-chair of the reparations task force in Detroit. But the ballot initiative isn't necessarily what got the task force established. Our city council president had it within her purview to establish a task force with or without it, but she wanted to know that there was some citizen support. So she waited until, the ballot initiative got passed to see how many people would support a task force. It was mostly favorable, so there was a resolution that established a task force that would be working for 18 months to produce a report with recommendations for reparations in the categories of housing and economic development. So that 18-month clock started as of April of last year when we had our first public meeting, and that group is due to produce a series of recommendations by October of this year. And U of M has a role now in helping the task force get that done, in that Center for Social Solutions is kind of air traffic control for all things U of M with regards to the Detroit task force. And we are working with Poverty Solutions to get what is called a harm report. So we're learning from people that have had success doing reparations in other places. So we had Robin Ruth Sibbons from Evanston come talk to us, and she said what was successful for them was to establish a harm report, which would lay out all the ways in which the municipal local government had harmed Black folks. So we decided that would be a good starting point for us as well. So Poverty Solutions is working on that report.
Okay. Thank you. At least I know you to be somewhat of a student now of the efforts around the country as you think about reparations and what really practically can be done in a time frame. In your view, how has the debate changed in the last 24 months or so as we think about the municipal conversations or the county conversations about reparations?
I think 10 years ago, if you were having a conversation about reparations, someone would hand you a tinfoil hat and ask you if you were feeling okay. I think that 5 years ago, it was still something that was considered more fringe, even though we were starting to see really amazing work happen. I think what we're seeing now is critical mass around momentum. We need reparations at the federal level, absolutely. And people are tired of waiting for that to happen. And so what we're seeing at the local level, and all politics are local, right? We're seeing community members and elected officials, our education institution partners, philanthropic partners, look at the landscape and say, what can we do in our communities right now? What are things that we can address in terms of harm right now? And it's amazing to see the speed in which things are moving. when Evanston was getting their framework up and functional, they were on the cutting edge, and I would say that Evanston is still on the cutting edge. But California instituting a task force at the state level to see what's happened in Detroit with a voter-driven ballot initiative, all of these things, I think for those of us who've been working in this space, in social justice spaces for 20 years, it's not something that I thought I would see in my lifetime.
Some part of this has to do with shifting public attitudes, and Monterey started there in answer to a previous question. But I was wondering, are there ways that we can get what seems to be polarizing concepts or ideas accepted more generally based on your research?
I think shifting opinion almost always takes time. And it takes narrative change. It takes investing into narratives, helping people change kind of their presumed narrative past for how they understand their different issues. But that's not to say that attitude change is not always the only way to pass policy. There's, for people who just want to see some type of reparative policy passed, who just want to see some type of redistributive act passed, you can reframe the policies in a race-neutral way and generate more support. But I think a lot of people would say that kind of doesn't have the reparative effect that we want to see take place in a reparations initiative, that a fundamental part of any reparations initiative is acknowledgement of the harm that white people and other non-Black people cause, governments cause, corporations cause, different institutions cause, so that the recipients can feel and recognize that this is something earned, that it's not a handout, it's not a gift, but it's, as the person said, it's delayed compensation. And so there's that element, but I think it's also important to emphasize some of the people who are interested in reparations are approaching it from a political standpoint, right? They just want to get reelected. And so I think there's ways also to emphasize that emphasizing reparations can really generate more turnout. We've done a lot of research looking at some of the critical parts of from the Democratic electorate are Black voters and young voters, and they're far more likely to turn out when candidates talk about reparations. So there's a variety of ways we can think about this for different audiences.
The historian and sometimes cynic in me flashes back to the last presidential election, at least on the Democratic side. Everyone had a reparation sentence, if not a plank, at some point. It was amazing to see how often it came up in the debates. I mean, the question, and as we think about it, is how we go from the rhetorical to actionable, which is sort of part of where we are today. I mean, as I think about this film, I mean, Daryl, come back to you. In making the film, anything jump out at you as surprising in the course of the filmmaking itself?
Gosh, so many things. And I think all of us on the production team would agree that we didn't know the story of Callie House. And this is a largely female, well, the key talent on the production team was all female, largely women of color. And so it resonated with us on a personal level, the boldness of Callie House, a woman in that time taking the steps that she did toward reparations. So that was one really key surprise element. And the other is that it really started us thinking about this conversation about reparations and our differences and our slavery, our history with slavery in contemporary terms. And so when we started changing our language and talking about our American racial divide as akin to apartheid, and we started thinking about slavery as first not slavery but enslavement and in fact human trafficking, that when we started to change our mindset, then it gave us a different perspective and conviction about why this was such an important story to tell and to get people to talk about.
And for those of you in the audience, if you want to read more about Callie House, I recommend a book on her by Mary Frances Berry, who was quoted in the film, who's a double Michigan alum, both PhD and law degree. It's from the University of Michigan, and I know Mary liked that plug. And so, Lauren, Elise, how can you see the film helping you in your own work?
For people who don't agree that it's something that is already needed, I think it makes a good case. I struggle, though, with, I think that the way that we currently conceive reparations, it's kind of a catch-all. I want people to understand that it's difficult for a system that is rooted in harm to run a program of authentic repair. Repair can't just be something you do, it has to be who we are. So I think it's more than thinking about land or a check. There's something holistic that needs to change. We need to change who we are as a society. Again, not just something we do, it's got to be how we are. And I feel like if we concentrate too much on these checks and this land and we give that, people be like, okay, we're done. Yeah. And Black people will not be whole if we just have a check and some land. That is not the sum of what we need to be made whole. And I feel like sometimes it diminishes our agency if we're waiting for government or some other group of people to give us something. There is work that we can do on our own to begin to heal ourselves that doesn't require someone else doing something. I also think there needs to be a reframe around one group giving another group something, or the government giving a group of people something. Like, that's part of it, but also everyone wins when we have reparation. The government wins. The way that woman talked about how healing it was for her to engage in this reparative process, like, for a person like her, it seems like money is nothing. Like, she had nothing else to gain in that regard. She was doing it because she was healing a trauma. There's a trauma there that, like, her bloodline has this, this tarnished history. So there's healing that can happen in every group of people. It's not just like Black folks get to win if we have this reparations. The whole of society wins when we have reparations. I feel like that's really important to getting buy-in from everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Elise?
So I think there's a study that Harvard Medical School did in 2021 about the impact of COVID, and specifically the question of reparations. And the data that they produced, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it if you need some light reading. The data that was produced, peer-reviewed, was that if the United States had engaged in a framework of reparations for Black people in America, it would have changed the course of the pandemic for all of us, for everyone, not just Black communities, but for everyone. It would have lowered the overall death rate, the infection rates, the secondary economic and education impacts that we're seeing. So when we're talking about reparations, I think to Lauren's point, we're not just talking about how we create or reduce harm for Black people. It's the debt that America owes, and the failure to act harms all of us in very tangible ways. We're going to be dealing with the impacts of COVID for the next generation, and not just the health impacts, but the economic impacts and the education impacts. I think that the film, to your original question, is an excellent starting place for a conversation. In a place like Washtenaw County, we like to think that we are very progressive. Ann Arbor, in particular, likes to think of itself as the shining city on the hill. The data does not support that. Mm-hmm. And so if we start the conversation with a film like this, incredibly well done, and I'm hoping that we're going to see a series. Just put that plug out there. it starts to create a conversation that I think is accessible for people who are not academics, who are not public policy wonks, or who, dream of research and data, like the folks on the panel do, right? That's my idea of a good time, but that's not true for everybody. And so how do we make this conversation accessible in a way that pulls people in, where they see themselves and actions that they can individually take to help drive the conversation forward? I agree that, we can't wait on other people to come and save us. And also, as somebody who works in government, we absolutely have a responsibility to address the harm that government as an institution is responsible for helping to create and continue to foster.
Great. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions for those in the audience. And so there are mics, I believe, stationed in a couple of different locations if anyone has a question. And while waiting for those.
I'll start out.
Okay.
I think this is the mic right here.
Yes.
Fantastic job as far as the film is concerned. But like Elise, I was expecting, and I do expect more, almost like a Henry Louis Gates as far as that Rivers That We've Flown, where they had more and more episodes. But the thing that gets to me about reparation, when I first heard about it in 1988, right out of college, about a year after college, I thought it was great, but we as Black people need a financial substance that I'm not getting, and we're not getting. Elise, you mentioned something about the common everyday person needs to understand the impact of how reparations will help us, but we also need to show the white community the impact that slavery had on them economically and how it still benefits them today. I didn't see that in the film, nor did I see that in any other thing talking about reparation. And that's very important because I think it was a statistic that Mr. Ostfeld, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, I truly apologize. You talked about the percentages. I think you said 77% of Black people, of course, is for reparation. For obvious reasons. Hey, I'm struggling. You're talking about giving me some free money? I'll definitely take it. But that's basically it. But we need a foundation, and you said, of course, I think it was 17%, somewhere around there, of course, of white people and people who are non-Black who didn't feel that. So what I think we need to move reparation on in a serious way is to show the impact of how slavery is now still benefiting white people today. The Homestead Act, and how 25% of white people today are benefiting from the Homestead Act. We talk about mortgages. People don't know the impact of how powerful slavery was because the first mortgages was not real estate or homes. It was the mortgage, of course, of slaves, of financing slaves. That's how banks did it back then. We're not talking about those things. So I personally feel if we do that, we can get the whole world to see our impact and our contribution. There would not be an America if it wasn't for Black people. There would not be an America if it wasn't for what we've done. We have to talk about that. And it's not about people of color, it's Black folk. So bless y'all, and just if you can address some of those things.
Thank you. I'm tempted to be the historian and not the moderator, but let me turn to my panel before I become the historian. And so anyone want to respond?
Yeah, so I think that notion of, and that was another surprising point to me, I think we talk in the film about the impact of land grants and how many people there are today who are beneficiaries of those initial land grants. And there absolutely is more to talk about. I wish we could do a series because it's very easy to, as the poet said, to turn away. And I think that's why we haven't seen the kind of advancement on reparations that one would think we are called to address. It's because it's very easy to turn away and to blame it on something else. But I believe that tide is changing when you look at the sheer number of reparations efforts that are happening all around the country. Even in the course of making this film, when we first interviewed the folks from the American Redress Network, where they have this mapping of where reparations efforts are, that number has grown since we locked the film. And every day as we did the production, we'd call each other or text and say, did you see? Did you see? There's something new. There's something new. So I think it is steamrolling its way forward, but I would agree more needs to be done to keep the conversation alive.
Anyone else?
I like the point that you emphasize in the film about the woman in the church telling people, especially white people, they need to reimagine their prosperity stories, to understand where would you be if your family didn't have access to the VA Act or mortgages, or you weren't subject to the discrimination in job hiring and things like that. I thought that was a really useful lens to think about narrative change.
I worry, though, that people being told that they aren't where they are because of their own efforts, if you would get some negative pushback.
Of course you would.
So, just in thinking strategically about what the tactic should be. I think white folks need to talk to white folks. I, for one, am tired of trying to convince people in institutions of our contributions and what we are owed. So I feel like, part of the penance of people like the woman in the film who's given that $100,000 a year, she also needs to engage in a speaking tour where she's talking to other white folks about her journey.
Three things I would note. I think perhaps not in the depth that it's called for, certainly not in 56 minutes. There was an attempt to actually talk about the depth, the debt and how it's linked both to slavery and to Jim Crow. And so, and it was referenced in at least three different ways. But to augment this, there's also additional information that you can find on the WQED site, because we realize you can only cover so much in 56 minutes. And so there are at least 10 vignettes with scholars from around the country in 5-minute segments that offer greater explanation. There are also then little sort of quarter-page to longer snippets, and that allow more engagement with the topic as well. And so that's there too, and so I reference that for everyone's benefit. But you're absolutely right. There's more work to be done, and Lisa's nod to me about a documentary was like, okay, Earl, can you go raise more money to get this? And so it's on my list for 24.
But I will just add that there's also a robust engagement initiative that is pairing communities all across the country with PBS stations in their market to engage in civic dialogue around this subject, and that is just launching. Some of them are launching today, but that will continue for the next, until it runs out of steam, and it'll continue at least for the next year.
Yes.
I believe he's been standing longer. I don't want to cut mine, but.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay.
First, a big thank you for the time that each of you are spending with us today. It's been wonderful to hear you and view the film. My question has to do more with one of the last comments about steamrolling, and it's about rate of progress. And it's wonderful to hear that there's a lot of change happening at individual communities and perhaps in some state levels, and that there are approaches in place to accommodate those that are willing. My concern, because of the federal potential here, is that what are the best strategies to take to get those that are a little less willing, or just don't want to change, don't want to accommodate a new way of thinking about wealth in this country. And so what I'm edging towards is, on the federal level, do you believe that's important, or should the focus continue to be on individual communities? And if federal is important, my point of view, which I'd like you to agree or disagree with, is that that will not change anywhere in the near term in the absence of a significant nationwide change to the impact of gerrymandering. And in other words, the constitution of state legislatures that is driven by the percentage of the population that you mentioned that is not democratic, not young, and not liberal. You can figure that out. So, if you would.
So I'll jump in with my 2 cents, and then I'll leave it to the people who really understand government and organizational workings. I think that all of these local initiatives will begin to serve as a model for how we might approach it on a federal level. I also don't think that there is one way of addressing reparations. I think that on a community by community basis, there's strength in doing what makes sense in those communities. There's power in addressing harms that happen across the street. And there's hope in allowing people who have lived across the street and walk by those differences every day to say, oh yeah, I have some culpability, I have some responsibility for my neighbors. So that's where I think that the local effort has power and potential to kind of feed up into the federal effort. But will that happen? Not sure. We haven't been able to pass HR 40, which isn't about check writing, it's a study.
Yeah.
And we can't say yes to a study on a federal level. So I'll defer to my fellow panelists here.
So my dad's got this joke that he likes to tell, which I'm sure he pulled from someone else. He says, why did the guy rob the bank? Well, that's because that's where the money was at, right? Voting is the same way. They keep trying to, and by keep and they, I mean folks who are not interested in younger, liberal, more progressive voters turning out to the polls, engage in disenfranchisement because the vote is valuable. We have historically low voter turnout rates. If people turned out to the polls in the same way that they share opinions online, we would have a very different social structure. So the idea that we need to get people engaged, and not just at a presidential general election, but at the local level, at the primary level, for the ballot initiatives on zoning, because all of those things really do impact conversations around the fabric of what our communities look like, and directly impact the kinds of things that we're talking about with housing access and gerrymandering. So we need people engaged in a different way than what we currently have. But that piece around, is it the chicken or the egg? We need to do both at the same time. And I agree that what we're looking at, I think, for local models is proof of concept.
Lauren?
Real quick, I would just say, if nothing else, the local models expand people's ideas about what is possible. I know that I had a lot of colleagues, like you said, people would look at you like you were crazy with the tinfoil hat. I had peers and colleagues in the nonprofit space and philanthropy, people in politics who never thought it would happen, and just the fact that we have a body that's going to attempt to make some recommendations in 10 months has got a lot of people thinking, if that can happen, what else might be possible?
We have time for one more question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Lauren, I believe it was you who said that thinking of reparations is more than just money and land, and I think you said it wouldn't make black people whole. So, my question is, say, economically or land-wise, that was just, and I think you said there didn't need to be more holistic societal change. So, what would make black people whole, more than just money and land?
You're going to get me in trouble. You want me to speak on behalf of all black people and say what would make us whole?
Okay,
well, here,
no,
let me
honestly.
reframe, though. I would say it's more about us getting in right relationship, if you understand that concept. I don't like talking about the work in terms of like gaps, because it positions one group of people as constantly like chasing after another group, and I don't think that's accurate, because again, both groups have something to gain. So I think it's more about talking to people on both sides about what we need to be in right relationship. And I don't think it's not a transaction, it's something deeper, something richer. I always feel like I'm gonna sound like a hippie in a space where people are talking about checks and houses and stuff. I think it's a spiritual kind of healing that we need. It's ancestral, it's, I don't know, it almost can't be quantified. It's hard to explain, but I know that it involves having more people at the table in the conversation to quantify what we both need.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If that answered your question, sorry.
I had said one last, and then a friend has begged to slide in, so Lynette.
It's not a question, Earl. I just wanted to make sure that we made the connection to Thursday.
Yeah, it's on my list.
Congratulations on the film and the conversation. prompted so many questions. I think any good dialogue prompts more questions. For people who are interested in the Jesuits part of this story, we have another MLK symposium event on Thursday at 4 in the Rackham Amphitheater. Anytime you saw the clips that said New York Times, those stories were done by a journalist named Rachel Swarns. She has spent the past 7 years working on a book about the Jesuit slaveholding, and she'll be here on Thursday at 4 to talk about that history and the fund that's been established at Georgetown and their continuing work. So we hope to see some of you there as well.
Thanks, Lynette. And my timer is blinking here, so I want to say thank you to my colleagues for being part of this panel and for what you had to share and for your perspectives on the film. So thank you. And I want to thank my colleagues and staff at the Center for Social Solutions, especially Doreen Tenajero, Jessica Cruz, and Sarah Morgan for their work in making sure this afternoon occurred. I want to remind you of that at 8 p.m. This evening on the World Channel and WGBH, there will be a re-showing and re-airing of the documentary. So for friends and families who were not able to be here, you can pass along the word. As you heard from Lynette, there is a conversation with Rachel Swarms on Thursday at 4 p.m. In Rackham. And then next Monday, there is also a reparations examination across the Americas. The Donner Institute is doing a special panel on reparations. You're invited to continue that conversation as well. Again, thank you. Thank you to all here, and have a great afternoon.